So welcome back to part 2 of this series. What is an LLC? So that's what we're going to be talking about in part 2. But it's very important for you to go back and listen to part 1 if you didn't, because it will help with the foundation that's being built throughout this 8-part series of, the LLC. What is an LLC? But just in sum, a very quick summary of what part 1 covered is we talked about the history of the LLC. We talked about the origins, where it was traced back to Germany, which as the US we went to and depended on a lot of law from. And now, it has spread throughout all 50 states in the US since 1996, but it was first brought here in 1997. And we're still going through the process of developing the body of law surrounding the LLC, being that it is so young. So we talked about that, and we talked about the progression of how the LLC was handled on the government level from the IRS, on the state level, and what that kind of looks like. And then we just kind of briefly went over other business entities that you can establish through the Secretary of State in your respective state. And we also talked about ways that you can engage in business and commerce without registering a business. But we talked about those risks that are associated with those ways, which is being a sole proprietor or a general partnership. 2 of them which you don't have to register with your state. And then we talked about the limited liability partnership or limited partnership. And we talked about the corporation. So in part 2, we're going to go ahead and we're going to cover more about what an LLC is, and just thinking about several things that should be on the top of your mind when you're deciding what is the best entity for you. Like I mentioned before, a lot of individuals determine that an LLC is the best entity for them just because they think it's easy. It's easier to understand. It may be easy for your particular state to register it. May not be a lot of requirements. Again, state by state, there are different requirements. Some states may be aligned and the same, but some states may be totally different, from the fee to whatever information has to be available when you register. Those things could differ, but for the most part, people feel like the LLC is something that they can grasp and they can handle, especially if they're a solo owner, a solo business owner. However, throughout throughout the series, as I cover the different sections, hopefully by the end you'll see that it appears that it is easier, but easier leniency can have you in legal trouble. So I want to just cover information with the LLC on, what you should know and what you should take in consideration. And one of those things is you want to take in consideration what you even want an LLC for. Is it the best entity? And if it is, then of course you want to do the right steps and take the right process. But an LLC, as I stated earlier, it stands for limited liability company. So individuals can form an LLC if you are an individual. So remember, we talked about being a sole proprietor. If you're an individual running something on your own, something that's either small, medium size, what have you, but it's just you, and you do not want your personal assets fair game, you want to separate your personal assets from possibly being brought into a situation where somebody wants to either, sue you, sue your company. You want to keep those things separate. And so that's what a limited liability company can do as a sole owner. It's limited liability. So if someone sues you, they're limited in what they can actually recoup from in order to make them whole in whatever damages that they're claiming. They're limited to this thing here, and they can't move over to this thing here. So they limit it to what the business may own, what the business may, gross revenue, but they're not moving over to your personal assets. So that's what an LLC can do. People can use an LLC for different reasons, running a business, just holding assets, family assets, business assets. But a lot of people also like an LLC because of the control. You can control management. So just like a corporation, you have the board of directors, and each person is, delineated or assigned a role, and their role is assigned certain tasks. You can do that with an LLC too. So you can decide, first you can mimic a board of director type structure, or you can decide those who are members of your LLC, either everybody has control and you decipher what that control looks like without even delineating roles. It's just that you have control and this is the type of control each member has. Or with an LLC, they like it because they can set it up to where there could be several members, but maybe one individual or isolated individual has control and the other members have zero control. So people like LLCs for that as well. And again, they like it because of the flexibility. You don't have to have bylaw, meetings and have the minutes to document that and all the other things that are required to have for a corporation, bylaws and all that great stuff. And then lastly, an LLC is an entity that allows what's called a flow-through taxation. I talked a little bit about that in the history of how the IRS decided to handle tax situations for single members and then a state. Well, that is where we're at right now. Single member LLCs are considered disregarded entities, meaning it's disregarded. Whatever you do for your business is disregarded off for that business to go onto your personal income tax. So you don't have to file a separate LLC tax return, and whatever you make is all together. So although the federal and state, they're commingling what you make together, you're looked at separately from your business for liability reasons. For liability reasons, you're not commingled. For tax purposes, you are. And that is, one of the great things that individuals like about the LLC. But again, there's more that goes into it that can kind of affect the tax status. But we'll get more into that later. So let's just talk about now, what are some things that should be at the top of your mind when you're deciding what type of entity to form and if an LLC does fit in that list of things that you may come up with. One of the first things I think an individual should think about is the nature of business. What type of business are you involved in? What are you offering to the public? Is it a product and service? Is it something that is in general planned for the masses? Or is it something that you want smaller and concentrated? It's something that's medium size, something that you want to pull the public into. You want to just think about the nature of the business when you're deciding what you are forming. Is it something where it's not an actual, operating business, but it may be a business that is just protecting and holding assets? So you want to think about that as well. And speaking of assets, you want to think about the nature of assets. What type of assets do you want to protect? Is it real estate? Is it intellectual property? What type of assets are you trying to protect? That will determine what type of entity you should also create. I know some individuals, say they create a corporation for real estate, but there's different type of things that you have to take into consideration when you have a corporation and you're dealing with real estate, especially on a tax level. There's a lot of things to consider when you're trying to move that type of asset in and out of a corporation, whereas an LLC, may offer more flexibility, no taxing and all that great stuff. So you want to think about the nature of assets that you're trying to protect. I talked about this earlier. Control. What type of control are you foreseeing for your business? Is it just you and you foresee bringing other people in, but do you want to manage what that control looks like? You want to manage the decision making? Or is it you and someone else as a partner that's coming in as owners? What does that look like? So you want to think about management control and the number of owners that are coming into this venture when you're thinking about what type of entity to establish. Do you want the business that you have to pass on? Is this going to be like a succession to family, succession to your kids, or do you want to just look at certain assets or your rights to be assigned to other people without the whole business going to family members or kids? So that would be something to think about when you're trying to decide what is the best entity for you to form. Is the business entity that you're forming, are you going to need help? Are you going to need investors? Are you going to need startup funds? Or is it just all you? How are you going to be able to move forward with this business if it is new? You want to take that in consideration when you're deciding what type of business entity to form, and if an LLC is one of the best fits for you. And then lastly, I think you should think about, privacy. Is there certain things that you want people to know and not know? Do you want them to know who management is? Do you want them to know who's even the owner of this company? Especially when they see assets out there. So anonymity is a really huge thing. And is that something that is important for you for a particular business venture or a company holding assets? If anonymity is important to you, then so shouldn't the type of business that you form and or the way that you may form a business that doesn't automatically get that anonymity. But so those are some of the things, very few things, that you should think about when you're trying to decide what type of business entity to form. And a lot of times people don't think about, they don't drill it down when they decide to form an LLC. They just figure, this is something I always hear. Two things: corporation, LLC. This is two things you hear flying around. And then most people feel like, well, not a corporation because I don't think I'm corporate level big. I'm not, seeing myself there. I'm just here, so it has to be limited liability company. But you have to drill down, why these questions. Why am I forming this type of business entity? And will it fulfill my why? Will it fulfill the things I need it to fulfill? Will it help me to not only limit my liability, but to also utilize the type of business structure to its fullest? Those are the questions that you have to ask yourself. So that's it about what is a limited liability company and some of the things to think about when you form it. So we're going to end part 2 off there, and then what we're going to come to next on part 3 is forming an LLC, how to properly form it. So when people do decide, individuals decide that LLC is the entity they want to form, are they forming it properly? Again, just because it seems easy or lenient in your state doesn't mean you have established everything you need to establish properly. And the whole purpose behind having a business entity, instead of running out there doing as a sole proprietor or running out there and doing it as a general partner, the whole purpose of having a business entity structure that's registered is protection. And so if you're not properly forming the LLC, then you may have shaved away at the very reasons why you want a business entity formed. So we'll get more into that on part 3.